Hello everyone, in this video I am going to explain the instructions for your lab for week 4 since I am unable to be in lab today due to a conference. So in this lab you are going to do some tasks related to creating your survey. So as you know, you've all picked a research question, and so today you're actually going to look at developing that survey that you're going to use to collect your data for your lab project. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this link here that is going to give me information about how to design a survey for a research study. So when you're designing a survey, the thing that we're really trying to do as public health professionals or as epidemiologists is we're trying to develop surveys that are pretty short so people will take them while, balancing the fact that we're trying to capture all the information that we need. Balancing, keeping a survey short and getting all the information you need is not easy. This document that I provide here describes some of the types of questions that we use in survey questionnaires. And it also, I'm going to talk about some of the common mistakes to avoid in designing your survey questions. Also, when you're creating these surveys, recognize that we want to minimize any burden to the participant. So you don't want them going to external sources to try and find information to, input into your survey. Rather, you want to ask easy questions that people know the answer to. So let's talk about types of questions that we use in different surveys. So the first type of question is a structured or fixed response question. Structured questions offer the person taking a survey kind of a closed set of responses from which they can then choose. This makes data collection and analysis much simpler, and it takes less time for people to answer. These types of questions, these structured questions, are best to use when you have a thorough understanding of the responses that people might provide, so you can appropriately develop the answer choices. Or two, when you are not trying to capture new ideas or thoughts from the respondent, you're able to just create a set of, structured responses that person can then select. So here's an example. Do you have a driver's license? Yes or no? Which subject do you enjoy the most at school? You can see that person can indicate one of these. Or how many hours a day do you spend doing homework? And you've got these ranges here, 0 to 1, 2 to 3, 4 to 5, or more than 5. Now, the requirements for these types of questions is that the responses that you provide as the researcher, these should capture all the possible alternatives for the answers for this question. So, sometimes you might want to consider, a catch-all response, so something like an other or a don't know. You can put this in if you're maybe, not sure if you're capturing every single thing, but, the best thing is to just have, a yes or no or any of these categories. When someone indicates other, you don't know what that other is, and so you don't necessarily have access to that information. So I highly recommend against doing some sort of, other. Each answer should be unique with no overlap between possible responses. So oftentimes, I get students that want to capture things like how many hours of sleep do you get on a night? And they'll say, 0 to 4, and then they'll say 4 to 5. Then their next category is 5 to 6. Well, if your first two categories were 0 to 4, and then your next one was 4 to 5, if you got 4 hours of sleep, you wouldn't know which response to pick. So you want to make sure that if you have, any kind of intervals that you've got in your fixed response questions, your intervals don't overlap. They need to be unique. So instead of 0 to 4, 4 to 5, I would maybe say 0 to 4, 5 hours, and then maybe 6 hours, or, 0 to 4, 5 to 6 hours, 7 to 8 hours. That would be more appropriate. All answers should be relevant and expressed consistently. No single response should stand out. So, when we're saying be consistent, if you're asking someone, how many hours a day do you spend doing homework? You want to make sure all of your potential responses are all in the same units. So if you're going to use, hours for the first one, use hours for all the rest of them. Do not, switch back and forth from hours to minutes. It just makes it really confusing for the person taking the survey. The next type of question that we use are what we call non-structured or open-ended questions. These are questions where we, very different from the other type of question. There's no list of answer choices from which the person can choose. Those respondents just, write their response to a question. It's best to use non-structured questions when you're exploring new ideas and you don't really know what to expect from the respondents. So for example, what is your favorite thing about being a Cal Poly student? These types of questions can be very, very time consuming, and it can be really difficult to analyze the data you get from them. I highly recommend against using this type of question. Based on the variables that I know all of you are collecting, I don't think this type of question is necessary. And so, you really should not use this type of question unless you absolutely have to. And I don't think for your research questions that anyone has a variable they're trying to assess in which they need to use a non-structured question. So please avoid this type of question for your lab. You can also do partially structured questions. So, this looks like a structured question, but it looks a little different because you've got this other, and then, you've got this line here where someone can fill in text. This is useful if you have a good idea of all possible responses, but maybe you want to leave open the possibility of others. Again, this is going to make your data collection and analysis more complicated. So, unless you absolutely have to do one of these, I, again, would not recommend doing it. You're going to create more work for yourself. And I think in terms of the variables that you all are assessing, there really isn't a need for this type of question. There's also rating questions that use Likert scales. And so, some of the instruments that you might use have a rating system that they use. These provide some sort of range of options. And so someone can, either mark, down at the lower end or at the upper end, but there's kind of this range, this scale that's provided. And this is an example here. Please describe how you felt about your Health 299 lab activity. You can indicate, unsatisfied, somewhat satisfied, satisfied, very satisfied, extremely satisfied. Some of these different indexes, these validated survey instruments, they will use these Likert scale, these rating form questions. And these are totally fine to use if you're using an instrument that uses one of these. And then lastly, we have ranking questions. So if you're trying to, get a respondent's opinion about something, it's best to have them do a rating rather than a ranking, because a ranking asks respondents to list their responses in order of preference. I'm not sure that any of you have a variable in which you're going to need to rank something. It can get a little confusing in terms of analyzing the data. So if you absolutely need to use one of these, you can. However, I highly recommend, using something like a structured question. That is going to be the easiest way to collect your data and also the easiest way to analyze the data that you collect. So there are some other common mistakes to look out for. So, besides the overlapping intervals with numbers, you want to watch out for double-barreled questions. So, for example, how have teachers and students at your school responded to the new 45-minute lunch period, satisfied or unsatisfied? You cannot tell whether that satisfaction is coming from the teachers or the students, right? So you want to make sure that you're not including a double-barreled question where you're asking about two things in one question. So a better way to do this would be to separate that out by teachers and students. Another example of something to avoid is leading questions. So, asking a question in a way where you kind of lead someone to an answer. So for example, this bad question would be, do you think that the new cafeteria lunch menu offers a better variety of healthy foods than the old one? A more neutral way to ask this is, how do you feel about the new cafeteria lunch menu compared to the old one? And then giving that person options to indicate there. All right. The next item in your lab I want to talk about is the data spreadsheet. So you're going to collect data using Google Forms to, administer your survey. You'll set up your survey questions in Google Forms, and then you will all take your survey. The data that you collect from your survey, you're going to download that, and you'll get it as a spreadsheet that's going to look something like this. And so what I want to note is that the responses for each respondent, so each person, are in the row here. So this is one person's answers here. The second row is one person's answers. This third row is one person's answer, and so on. Each variable in your data is going to be the title of that variable, the name of that variable is going to be on the top, and this whole column is going to represent all of the responses for that particular variable. So for example, this is college. You can see these are all the responses for college. The height in inches here for each person is represented in this column here. So you can see this is the height, and then each person's response for the height, and so on with all these variables. The types of variables that you collect can have different formats. So variables can be, numeric, where you're actually getting a number. So for example, maybe your height in inches is going to be, a number. It'll be, for example, 66, or it could be a character. So maybe you indicate your college is CSM for the College of Sciences and Math. That would be character format. The only non-character that is accepted as numeric is a decimal. So, if you've got any of these little symbols here, that's going to be considered a character by your statistical software when we get to that point. But everything will be either character or numeric. Variables can be continuous or categorical. So continuous being, a continuous number. So for example, BMI would be continuous. You'll get a BMI of, whatever your BMI is calculated as, or it can be categorical, right? So it can be male or female. It can be your college, whether it's, the College of Sciences and Math. Also, your categorical variables, they can then be broken down into either nominal variables or ordinal variables. So for nominal variables, there's really no inherent order or ranking. So for example, male or female, gender, there's no order to that. Ordinal is where there's some sort of order to that variable. So maybe it's a ranking from 1 to 5, and there's some sort of meaning for, being on the lower end at 1, and there's a meaning for being on the higher end at 5, or there's just some sort of order to it, right? So school, high school would be earlier on than, college and graduate school. There's some sort of order to those variables. So that would be an ordinal variable. I also want to talk about some best practices for how to set up a data set that is going to help you for your analysis. So when you've got all that data you download, when you download it, all of your questions that you indicated are going to be in the spot up here where the variable name should be. Now, you're going to want to rename those variables with a variable name that's easy for you to understand that you can use for your analysis. So you're going to want to put each variable name in the first row of your data sheet. Each variable should be unique. So you don't want to have, BMI in one column and then another thing for BMI with exactly the same name. All of your variable names should be unique. You don't want to have the same variable name for two variables. You want to choose names that are short and meaningful. So if you've got, height underscore IN, that means it's height in inches, versus height underscore CM, that would tell me it's height in centimeters, right? That's a short name that very clearly tells me what it is. The variable name should start with a letter. It's just rule of thumb. Variable names should have no special characters or spaces. So you want to make sure you don't have any special characters in your variable names, and you don't want any spaces in your variable names. Instead of a space, you can use an underscore. So for example, here you've got height underscore IN for inches. that takes the place of that space. And so you should use that in terms of following best practices. You want to include a unique identifying number for each observation or participant so you can keep track of everyone in your data, and you want to be consistent. So, this is all consistent here. Everything is in, the same format versus here, everything looks all different. You want to keep that consistency. Nominal variables are okay to leave in a character format, but ordinal variables are best converted to numeric format. So, if you have items on a Likert scale, so we've got agree, somewhat agree, neutral, somewhat disagree, or disagree. If kept in character format, your computer will sort them alphabetically. And so, you don't want to rearrange the order of that. So, one way that you can preserve the order in your data is to give them a number and actually label them. So 1 might be agree, 2 might be, the next thing, all the way up to 5, which is disagree. Use a separate column for each piece of information. So if you've got, blood pressure where you've got 2 numbers, you don't want to put 120 over 80. Often Excel will do a calculation, a math calculation. You want to keep them in separate columns. So you'll have a column for 120 and then a column for 80, 2 separate columns. You'll need to decide what you're going to do with missing values if you have any. I highly recommend just using a period. Most statistical software will recognize a period as a missing value and it will treat it as such. So make sure to use a period to indicate any missing data that you have. And if you do have any dates, this is the best way to format it, but I'm not sure that everyone has questions related to a date, so this might not apply to you. Okay, so here are your actual instructions for your lab today. In lab today, or this week I should say, you're going to design and pilot test a survey, and you're going to conduct preliminary editing of your survey data. So again, please refer to those documents that we just went over for best practices to make sure you're following best practices. So for part 1, you want to design and pilot test your survey. So you're going to develop a preliminary survey in Google Forms. This is going to allow you to collect pilot data for your research question. Now, this is pilot data you're capturing today. This is not data that you're going to use for your final analysis for your lab. Today, you're just piloting that survey to see how it goes. You're creating the research questions, and you're going to get feedback on those from your peers. So your questionnaire that you develop, your survey, should capture data on at least these 7 topics. So your inclusion or exclusion criteria, you should have questions around those. Remember, you have to ask those questions. For example, maybe one of your inclusion criteria is the person has to be a Cal Poly student. You have to ask about being a Cal Poly student to know if that person meets your inclusion or exclusion criteria, right? So if my inclusion criteria is, being a Cal Poly student, my first question might be, are you a Cal Poly student? And I would have the options to be yes or no. Once you put in your inclusion, exclusion criteria questions, then you need to ask your questions around your independent variable. And then you've got questions on your dependent variable. If you are a group that is taking questions, you're using a validated survey instrument, please pick like 3 questions from that instrument. Do not use the whole thing. You'll have people taking a survey that'll take them over an hour. So just pick a few questions that you think are the most relevant for your research question and pick, maybe 2 to 3 questions at the most from whatever instrument it is that you're using. And then, the next 3 variables, you should have questions around your potential confounders. So again, remember last week you had to identify 3 confounders. You'll list those actual questions for assessing those specific variables. And then you want to have a feedback piece where your classmates can, leave you feedback on your questionnaire. Maybe they can tell you that your question on your, first potential confounder was confusing and they didn't know what to put, right? So this is how you're going to get feedback on your survey. For each topic, you have to decide what type of survey question. So hopefully most of you are using fixed questions. If you're using inventories, you might have some sort of ranking question, but think about which one is going to be the most appropriate. And when you're done, you can send the survey link to the students in the lab through Canvas. What I'm going to do is I'll show you, I'm going to set up on the lecture Canvas page, I'm going to set up a board where you can post your survey links for your classmates to take. I would recommend you take your own survey just to get some responses. And then if you can get, responses from just a few more people, whether they're inside the class or outside the class, it doesn't really matter at this point. But if you could get maybe like 3 to 4 people who are, other students outside of your group to take your survey and to get feedback, that will be really helpful. So once you, collect your survey information via Google Forms, you can, download that information as an Excel sheet. As a reminder, you are creating your actual survey in Google Forms. So when you're in Google Forms, you should be able to download that as an Excel sheet, and then you're going to conduct a preliminary editing of your survey data. So I'm going to walk you through some of the basic steps for editing your data using JMP or JUMP. Hopefully you have downloaded that software by now, because you will need to use it for this week's lab. And I do expect everyone to download JUMP. Everyone should be using it, so you all learn how to use the software. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to do is download your spreadsheet from Google Forms and then import it into JMP or JUMP. So you'll do File, Open, and then you're going to create an ID variable by adding a column. So at the top of your JMP application, there should be a tab titled COLS for columns. It's called calls, and you'll click that and you'll go to create, it'll be for new column. When you do that, this window should pop up and you'll call it ID here in the name and then any other properties that you need to fix. And then you will create your variable names according to those best practices by renaming your column. So you can go to the column info. I think you can right click on the top of that column where the question is, and it should be able to take you to column info, and you should be able to rename each of your variables according to best practices. You then want to check that the variable types are specified correctly as well in that column info. You can either do it there, or you should be able to go to the left side of the screen and you'll see that there's these different colored icons. If you click on the colored icon, it'll let you change the type of variable that it is. And so you want to make sure, if you've got a continuous variable, it should be that blue icon, or if it's categorical, it should be a red icon for categorical. You want to check that your variables are the types of variables that you think they are. If it's not correct, then, again, you can click on that icon and change it. Okay, the next thing you want to do is try recoding variables. So just for practice today, all you have to do is recode one variable. So let's say you want to, recode a variable that currently has, 6 categories for college. Let's say you want to make it into 2. And so you can highlight, the column. Let's say the column is titled college. You can highlight that column and then go to the calls and go to recode. When you do that, you can name the new column. So you'll give it a new name. So let's call it college 2 in this case. And then you'll fill in the new values, the new value column with your 2 new category variables, and then you'll click recode, and you should see the new column with the recoded values. So for this lab, you need to submit 3 files. So you're going to have the responses to your survey in an Excel file. These are just the raw data that you download from Google Sheets. The second thing is that you want an edited spreadsheet saved as a JUMP file. So this should include at least the original variable names, the original variables representing the 6 topics specified for the survey, a newly created ID variable, names for all variables that follow best practices. So you want to make sure that all your variables don't have those questions in the top. They should all have names that are provided according to those best practices. So remember things like not including characters, not including spaces, all those best practices that we went over. All the variable types should be specified correctly. So if you have, an ordinal or a continuous variable, that should be specified correctly in your JUMP document. And then a newly recoded variable for just one chosen variable. And then lastly, you want a document that includes the link to your survey. Please make sure that that's a publicly available link that I can access. And then you want a paragraph that summarizes what worked well or what didn't work well in your survey. Think about, is there anything you would change based on the responses you received in your pilot test? And then justify your decisions about the questions you will or will not use, or maybe options, things like that. So think about those things and, write an in-depth reflection. And then, a paragraph describing any recoding that you expect to do with your study data. Maybe you've got, a variable that currently has, 6 options, and maybe, you're looking at the number of hours of sleep and you've got it as, 0 to 4, 5 to 6, 7 to 8, and then maybe 9 to 10. And maybe you've got all of those different categories. Maybe you decided you wanted to, recode that to anything, 6 hours or less and 7 hours or more. So, maybe you want to recode that variable that way, so you just have those 2 categories instead of all those different categories for the sleep options. And then, for missing data, missing values, hopefully you're just going to indicate those as a period, so your statistical software will recognize them. I also just wanted to note that I included the link to a discussion post where you can add the link to your Google form survey that your group creates for your lab, so other people can pilot test your survey. I am currently on the homepage of our main 318.01, our lecture homepage. So you should be able to add those there, and I'll send an announcement out to everyone in the class as a reminder to take those surveys. So those are kind of the big instructions for this lab. I know that this lab is a lot of work, and so if you do have questions on the lab, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help you. I will have office hours again on Wednesday from 1 to 3. I am also available to meet with you at another time if that doesn't work. And I also want to mention, I know a lot of you cannot come to the Thursday lab. You might have conflicts, which is why you signed up for the Tuesday lab. But if anyone from your group is able to come to the Thursday lab, please feel free to send them. Even if it's just one person from your group, you are welcome to come to lab on Thursday, and I can go over any questions you have on your lab and help kind of walk you through any of the steps that might be confusing at this point.